Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, Stacey, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Stacey Freedenthal. Stacey, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
You're welcome. So Stacey is a suicidologist. Her work focuses on all things suicide, helping people stay alive and want to stay alive, guiding loved ones through grief and healing if the worst happens, and teaching students and professionals how to do all of that as well. She has 2 books out. The first is called Helping the Suicidal Person, Tips and Techniques for Professionals. And her most recent book is called Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. Stacey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk to you. But before we dive in here, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Sure. I grew up in Houston, Texas, but I'm not considered a native Texan because I was born in Connecticut, even though we moved before I was a year old. And
seriously?
Seriously.
Are you made to realize that every day that you're
yes, not? When you live in Texas, you are. Especially of all places for me to have been born, it was Connecticut, which meant I'm a Yankee.
Right.
But without any of the benefits of having been a New Englander. And but now I live in Denver, Colorado, and I've lived here since 2005.
Okay. How did all this start for you?
Do you mean how did I become a suicidologist? Yeah. Or how did I first get interested in it?
Both. However you want to answer that. How the heck are we talking today?
How the heck did I become a suicidologist, which many people don't even believe is a real word.
Yeah.
So, but the Oxford Dictionary says it is, so I'm going with that. Well, I mean, there's personal and professional reasons. Personally, I myself have had suicidal thoughts in the past, and starting at a pretty young age. The earliest diary I have where I talked about it, I was 12 years old and having thoughts of killing myself. And then I grew up in Texas at a time when, well, I mean, in my high school years, there was a suicide cluster happening in Plano, Texas, which was about 4 hours away from us, but it was constantly in the news. And so I was always aware when there was another suicide because, you know, part of the media is, I don't know if you know that song, Dirty Laundry, that they like to report bad news. So I was always aware. And then suicides started happening in our city that I was aware of. And then in a 5-day period in high school, 2 people I knew died by suicide.
Oh my God.
We were 15. Although they may have already turned 16, my birthday's a little later. And the first person I didn't really know well, I just knew who he was. But the second person was a friend of mine. And I was with him the night that he ended up taking his own life. We had been at a party together. And so I remember, I mean, this might sound a little off topic, but I'm getting there. I remember after getting the news on the phone, walking outside and sitting on the curb, I remember looking at the sky. It was this beautiful blue. And I thought, how could he have wanted to leave this blue sky? Which is really sappy, but that's just where my mind went. And then I really, really thought, why didn't he tell us? And why didn't he get help? And as it happens, that's what I ended up doing my doctoral dissertation on in 2005 was adolescents with suicidal thoughts who don't get help. So I feel like the seed to suicidology was planted there. I mean, maybe it was planted with my personal experiences, but that well, and this was personal too, but that loss of my friend just gave me this question that I still am trying to answer.
Let me ask you this, and go as far as you want here, but you said from a very early age you started having suicidal thoughts. Give us some context here.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I have diary entries when I was in seventh grade saying things like, I hate myself, I hate my life, I wish I could kill myself without it hurting anybody.
Well, did you
Because
grow up in a traumatic environment? I mean,
I wouldn't say it was traumatic, but in my very early childhood, I I have to be careful because I know my mother's going to hear this show. But but when I was young, I was alone a lot, and I was alone in ways that now I think somebody would probably call CPS and say this little girl is wandering the neighborhood without anybody supervising her. And the most profound example I can give of that is when I was about 7 or 8. My father took me to this big urban park in Houston called Memorial Park, and it's like preserved pine forest. And I was excited to spend time with my father at the park, but when we got there, he said, "Okay, I'm going to take a nap." And I said, "Well, what am I going to do?" And he said, just explore. So I wanted to find the end of the river because there's a big bayou in Memorial Park, and I thought it was a river, but it's a bayou. And guess what? It goes to the Gulf of Mexico. So the end was about 45 miles away.
oh,
And I was trying to find the end, and I ended up, it became dark. I got scared. I started screaming for help. I was lost. And I ended up being rescued. I mean, this is so dramatic, being rescued by a police helicopter.
oh,
And I mean, this police officer came down this kind of cloth rope, I guess, rope ladder, and he, hefted me up in his arms, and we went back up, and
wow.
they took me on a ride with the door open. I was terrified. The door to the helicopter was open, and tell you what, that cured my fear of heights that I had until then. Exposure therapy.
Yeah.
And then I was transferred to one police car and then to another, and we were looking for my father, and they put out what now I know is called an APB, and the officer was on the radio describing the car, and he was on the other side of the intersection, and I said, oh, there he is. And so in the middle of the intersection, we pulled up, and my father rolled down the window, and he said, "Officer, I can't find my daughter. She's been gone for hours." And
Mm-hmm.
it was a very dramatic time, but I think
Mm-hmm.
it also captures like that I was alone a lot. I had two
Mm-hmm.
older sisters, but they were 4 and 5 years older than me, and I was the brat.
Mm-hmm. So now I kind of want to, so I asked you a question. I said, when you said you had suicidal thoughts, I kind of immediately in my mind went to, okay, where does this come from? And maybe we'll get to this a bit later, but do suicidal thoughts originate? I mean, do they just come out of nowhere?
That's a really good question. I've asked my students, because I teach a class every quarter on suicide assessment and intervention. And one of the first assignments is to look at your own personal experiences, attitudes, and beliefs around suicide, of course, within their own comfort level and boundaries. And one of the things I ask them to consider is, when did you first learn about suicide?
Mm-hmm.
And no one can remember. It's always through osmosis. They just
Mm-hmm.
somehow picked it up. But one time a student came to my office and she said, "I first learned about it when I was 3 years old, and I was so unhappy. I didn't want to be alive anymore."
Wow.
And that really stuck with me because she had a concrete moment where, first of all, she was in so much pain as such a young child that she wanted to die.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows if she knew it would be permanent. She was so young, but the fact that she had that thought. And also it stood out for me because I don't know when is the first time I ever knew that people take their life. I have a letter because I'm working on a memoir about these experiences, and maybe even one day I'll finish it. I've been working on it for quite a while, and I found this letter in a box of things that my mother saved from our childhood, my sisters and mine, things like test scores and drawings, but also there was a letter that I had written apologizing to my parents for something wrong I had done. And in the letter, I was very mean to myself. And one of the things I said was, if I don't get better, because I was, in hindsight, I had ADHD, I was hyperactive, and I was diagnosed later, but at the time I didn't know that was what was happening. It would have helped if I had known, because then I could have known that there was an explanation, but I was very hyper, really hard controlling my activity. And I said, something along the lines, these aren't the exact words, but something along the lines of, I know I'm a bad girl. I know I've been bad. And then I said, if I don't get better, I will jump in a lake if you want me to. And I don't remember writing that letter. I mean, I've got it, but I don't remember. But I think that may have been me saying, I'll kill myself, because jumping in a lake, like to say, I'll jump in a lake if I don't get better. I loved swimming.
Right.
I wasn't saying, hey, I'll go and have a good time swimming in a lake. And I think that may have been the first time that, or at least the first time I have evidence of, in terms of, souvenirs, or not souvenirs, but, artifacts. So
how did you get to the point where you began studying this, where you wanted to study this?
Yeah, I mean, I had this probably unhealthy fascination with suicide for a long time. I think really ever since my friend had died. And then I started experiencing depressions young, probably around 12 when I first wrote that in my diary. But they kind of got worse every year. And I would think about suicide a lot without intent, but I would think about it just about wanting to do it, or how I would do it, or what I would say in the note. And I mean, later a therapist said to me, "You're obsessed," and I think I really was a little obsessed. And now I have this line I just wrote recently in working on my memoir. Because now I'm considered an expert in what we know about suicide. Of course, nobody's an expert in what we don't know, but people have called me an expert. And I wrote down, what is expertise but obsession plus an advanced degree? So I think, now it's like sublimated, it's become a healthy obsession in terms of I'm trying to help other people, and I'm learning as much as I can to help my clients, to help my students, to help my readers. But you asked me, when did I first start studying it?
Yeah. How did you get to the point where you're like, I want to study this. I want to really study this. Yeah.
For real study it. Well, I was a journalist first, after college. And then I volunteered at a suicide hotline, and this was after I had become suicidal, and I had actually made a suicide attempt earlier in the year. So like in January, I had made the attempt, and then that fall, I volunteered at a suicide hotline, and my therapist wouldn't give me permission. So I didn't tell them. They said, if you're in therapy, you need your therapist's permission, and he wouldn't.
Oh, wow.
He thought I was too fragile. But I really wanted to, so I just didn't tell them I was in therapy. And I was worried because, I had been very suicidal very recently, but that was when I discovered something that, I mean, I said this in an interview recently, and I realized later it sounded really arrogant for me to say I have a particular gift, but it's for something that isn't that big of a deal. But I have a gift for compartmentalization. And it was really amazing to me that working on the suicide hotline, I could be with a client, not a client, a caller. I could be with a caller on the line and be fully present with them. And in being present with them, I was sort of outside of myself, if that makes sense. And I mean, really, I think that working at the hotline, that involved, and now as a therapist, that those involve some of my most intense moments of mindfulness. And I've meditated.
Right.
But
Right.
meditating, my mind wanders a lot more than when I'm really focused on what the person is saying.
Right.
So I volunteered at that hotline, and around that same time, I was needing to change careers because I had developed carpal tunnel syndrome and I didn't like journalism. There were parts of it that seemed exploitive to me. And so I went to school to get my MSW, but I didn't know what I was going to do. I wasn't sure that I wanted to be a therapist. I wasn't sure I had the fitness to be a
Mm-hmm.
therapist and the mental fitness. And then, but I worked at another counseling line, and this time not as a volunteer, but as an employee throughout my grad program. It was at the University of Texas Counseling Center. They had a 24-hour hotline. And I just really, that work just has been very fulfilling for me. It's very, I mean, to me, it's very precious.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I mean, this is going to sound really perhaps overwrought, but what a sacred honor to be able to be present with somebody in a moment of profound suffering for them. Like
Right. I
I,
agree. Yeah.
and
Let me ask you something. So you said you had made an attempt.
mhm.
Have you made multiple attempts?
Yes,
Okay.
I've,
And um, sometimes people make attempts that are what calls for help is a
mhm.
term that we use a lot. Where were you on that spectrum and continuum of intent?
That's a good question. And one of the things I've written about, and I had an article published on, can't remember what the title was, but it was about the challenges in assessing suicidal intent. And one of the things I say in the article is often the person attempting suicide doesn't know their intent. And
Hmm.
if you ask them afterwards, they may not either remember or they never really knew. And so I draw from my own experience with that, because the first time I attempted suicide was in 1994. And there was this flurry of events. I was very depressed, and my therapist had called my mother and asked her to come be with me in Dallas. And she was, getting ready to go to the airport. And I thought, oh my God, I only have a few hours to do this before my mother comes. And so in the moment, I remember thinking, and I'm not even a religious person, Guy. I mean, I'm not I don't follow organized religion or anything like that. But I remember thinking, I'm giving it to God.
Mm-hmm.
And when I hurt myself, I thought, I don't know if this is going to kill me or not. I'm giving it to God. And then I tried a few more times, and then my mother called and said, I'm going to the airport now. And I told her what I had done. And she called the therapist. And a couple days later, I was actually hospitalized, because my mind was fixated on
Mm-hmm.
killing myself. I mean,
Wow.
it's really a phenomenon. Now that I'm on the other side of it and I observe it in other people,
Mm-hmm.
I compare it to a storm, like that a
Mm-hmm.
storm can take over your mind. And this is why when people blame themselves or say, I should have been able to prevent it, things like that, I feel like we can't stop a tornado.
Right. Right.
And I don't mean we can't prevent somebody from dying by suicide. I don't want to feed into that myth.
Mm-hmm.
But I do mean that suicidality is bigger than any one person.
Mm.
So there is something going on that is just really a force of nature. And but you asked me a question. Oh, so then so that time I would say my intent was flimsy. And
Mm-hmm.
the way I said it in a talk was, I can't remember, I said something about, in the first attempt, it was like I had a broken heart. In the second attempt, it was like I had a heart attack, because the second
Mm-hmm.
attempt, my intent was much more resolved. And I wrote a note, and
Mm-hmm.
I put up a sign for anyone. I had two friends who had keys to my place because of my pets. So I put up a not a sign, it wasn't, like a formal sign, but a sheet of paper that I taped in my doorway inside my house saying, don't go inside.
Mm.
And and then I made an attempt and stopped, because my physical survival instinct took over, because what I did involved not being able to breathe. And I was just laboring so hard to breathe. And I
Mm,
just kind of had this aha moment of, oh my God, I'm gonna
mhm.
die. Like I had this almost like reconnection with reality of what am I doing? And so then I rushed to undo what I'd done so that I wouldn't pass out because I was seeing black. And obviously I survived, but I look back on that. And even talking with you about it now, I'm thinking about it. Like I think I couldn't have intended it that much.
Mhm.
I had a dog and a cat in my apartment with me.
Right.
And I couldn't have done that to them, but I did. So I don't understand. Like I still don't understand it. It was 30 years ago.
Who commits suicide?
What do you mean? Who dies by suicide?
Who dies by suicide? Oftentimes when we're talking about topics of mental health, it's very difficult, if not foolish, to generalize. And yet, with suicide, there's an outcome, right? There's one outcome. So, do people who successfully commit suicide, are there commonalities there?
There are, there's research, there's commonalities that have been found in research. And one of the biggest commonalities, and it's almost obvious, but is they use a firearm. And I don't mean this as advice to anybody. Please don't misconstrue
No,
what I'm
of
saying.
course. Yeah.
But this is why it's so important to keep a firearm
Mm,
away from anybody, as much as you can, away from anybody who shows warning signs. And even people who don't show warning signs, even people who don't have depression, people who don't have mental illness are at higher risk for suicide if there's a firearm in the house. There's been research that's controlled for all these different factors. And
mhm.
just having a firearm in the house increases suicide risk.
Along with that, do most people, or does is do everyone who commits suicide, are they depressed? Are they hopeless? Are they helpless?
They're definitely not all depressed. There's new research that's come out in recent years that shows that fewer people have mental illness when they die by suicide than we knew, or than we thought. It used to be said that 90 to 95% of people who die by suicide have mental illness. And now you'll see studies that say more like 50, 60, 70%. And of course, someone could have a mental illness that's not been diagnosed and nobody really knew about. So we have to look at those statistics critically.
Right.
But I think for some people, there's not mental illness. But there's abject misery. For some people, that
Right.
their living conditions are so hard and painful that they can't see getting through it.
Right. I mean, this might seem obvious, but people who are happy are not committing suicide.
Exactly.
Right. Um, okay. What are some of the warning signs?
Well, definitely the ones we hear a lot about, like, people talking about suicide, making jokes about suicide, making statements like, nobody would care if I wasn't here, or, what's the purpose of living?
Hmm.
Statements like that. People expressing that they're a burden to other people. Um, and then, the obvious ones like just outright depression or psychosis, addiction. Those are all, uh, especially when they're active, like active psychosis and worsening addiction can be warning signs. Trauma, loss, grief. And there's also, we can probably all cite somebody, some celebrity or somebody we know who died where it was utterly shocking and the
Hmm.
person didn't seem to give off any signs.
Right.
So that's part of the burden and the mystery of suicidality.
And there's a difference, right, between having suicidal thoughts and, wanting and having intent too, right? And that's
Yes.
part of the assessment process. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, not to get geeky on you, but
No, you
I
can
mean,
get geeky. That's what that's what we do here.
okay, I'll get geeky. So 14 to 15 million people in the United States seriously consider suicide every year, according to,
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, and in that statistic is almost 1 out of 5 high school students. And these are studies. So the high school students, it's the youth risk behavior surveillance study where they're asked in the last year, have you seriously considered, I don't remember if the exact words are killing yourself or attempting suicide. But it's directly about suicide. It's not hurting yourself, which
Hmm.
is a much broader construct.
Right.
And I think in the most recent one, it was 18.7% of high school students said yes. And then for the adults, the study is the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And so, obviously they don't interview everybody, but they extrapolate that from the percentage who said yes, that it's this many million Americans. I think the NSDUH, don't quote me on this, but I think it's around 11 to 12 or 12 to 13. And then adding on the high school and adolescents, it can go up to 14 to 15 million. And and so at the same time, almost 50,000 people die by suicide. And so what that means is
Every
99,
year,
yes, in the United States, in the United States.
50,000 people.
Yeah, I think it's about 47,000 something was the last statistic, 47,000 and some hundreds. And obviously, oh my God, that's terrible that many people die by suicide. And it also shows us that 99.7% of people who have serious suicidal thoughts or who report that they had serious suicidal thoughts don't take their life.
Hmm.
And so I think it's important for people to know that, not to minimize or dismiss those who do have intent,
Hmm.
but to not presume everybody has intent and everybody is in an emergency and everybody needs to have 911 called. Because I think
Mm.
there's a stereotype that if somebody says they're thinking of suicide, oh my God,
Right.
get them to an ER, call 911. And I know some colleagues in the suicide prevention community, that is their message. And
Mm.
they say it's always an emergency if someone has suicidal thoughts. But I think that kind of messaging can do a disservice to people with suicidal thoughts and the people who care about them, because it conveys that you can't just talk with the person and can't just listen to what's going on with them. And
Hmm.
obviously, if they're on the verge of killing themselves, then yeah, you need more intervention. But if they're having thoughts of killing themselves without a weapon nearby and without active high intent or
Right. Right.
auditory hallucinations telling them to kill themselves, things like that, then they can have a conversation.
Hmm.
And a lot of people, I mean, obviously, listening isn't a cure for everybody, but for many people, it really helps for them to be able to talk about what they're feeling and to connect with another person. And it doesn't help them to be shuffled off to an emergency room or to have the police come.
Can you I want to ask you about your time at the suicide hotline, and I kind of want to go there if we can, and ask you to share an experience of what it's like talking to someone who is suicidal. Can you take us there?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's of course it's not easy, but there's a psychologist who said in an article, I think he wrote in an article, that it's shameful that we haven't trained mental health professionals to not be afraid of of talking with someone who's in a suicidal crisis. And I very much disagree. I think fear is an innate instinct, and it tells us something,
Hmm.
and so I do, even now, even having written a book called Helping the Suicidal Person, and another book, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. I had to look and make sure I said the title right. Even now, I still feel fear if somebody is having intense thoughts of ending their life. because I so much want them not to, and because so much is out of my control, so it's a balance between doing everything I can, but also knowing that ultimately I can't do everything. I'm going to do everything I can to try to help this person get through this crisis and get to that other side where they're like, where they don't have to come close to dying to want to live.
Can you give us a specific example of someone you talked to and what it was like? What did they say? Why are they calling you? What do you say when you get on the phone with them?
Yeah. That's a good question, because some people feel like, well, if they're calling, then obviously they don't want to die. But I've had more than one experience in the past, not face to face, but when I was working phones, I had more than one experience where somebody called after they had overdosed, and the overdose altered their consciousness enough that a part of them reached out for help, even though another part of them didn't want to. And in fact, this isn't from my hotline days. This is when I was in the hospital. I met somebody who I'm still very dear friends with, and she attempted suicide multiple times and was really, really in a bad place. In fact, she's the person where I first had the realization of she might kill herself. I'm going to do everything I can, but she still might die. And she had an experience while we were friends where her husband was asleep in the other room and she overdosed, and she called the suicide hotline and said, I don't want to die alone. She said, I called because I took an overdose, and please, I don't need help. Don't try to talk me out of it. Don't try to talk me into going to the emergency room, but I want somebody to talk to before I lose consciousness. And the counselor said, okay, let's talk. And he was talking with her, and she was engaged in this conversation and getting more and more sleepy. And then there were red and blue lights and banging at the door. And the way she tells it to me is that she said, you called the police. And the counselor said, what did you expect me to do? And I love that story because it shows, well, I love it, but love is kind of a perverse word to use because it's also extremely sad, but it shows how the mind can get so distorted that you could call the police. I mean, you could call a hotline and expect them to not call for help.
Right.
And the suicidal mind. Recently, I talked to somebody who's has a teenager with suicidal thoughts, and their teenager asked their parents to help them kill themselves.
Wow.
And so people can just get in a very irrational state of mind. And so when I would be on the phone with somebody in an actively suicidal place, oftentimes I was like, I remember one person who called from a motel and had pills in their hand. And basically I was just trying to talk them into letting me have someone come help them, whether it was their roommate or their RA. They weren't in the dorm, but they could have come. And ultimately they gave me permission to call the police, to have an ambulance take them to the hospital. So when it's very, very urgent like that, there's not as much space for, so tell me the story of how you came to think of suicide. There's more like, oh my gosh, this person is going to kill themselves in the next few minutes.
What's the goal of someone who works on the suicide hotline?
That's a good question. It's going to vary. So I think the goal predominantly, of course, is to prevent suicide. I just read an article about the high rate of suicide among Indigenous people in Greenland. Heartbreaking article. I don't know. Do you do show notes with your podcast?
Yes.
I can send you the link.
Yeah.
It's from 2016, and they had a woman interviewed in the article whose son had died by suicide. And she's an amazing woman. She's older. I mean, I think now she may be in her 70s or 80s. And she worked at a suicide hotline to try to prevent other young people from dying by suicide. And it took a huge toll on her. And their doctor said, this is too hard for you. It's, activating your trauma. You're in a continual state of stress. You need to take off for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And she did. And then she went back. And
Oh my
it just
God.
gives, and for a lot of people, and not just hotlines, but just in suicide prevention, for a lot of people, it gives meaning to what they've gone through to kind of do something good with it.
Right, right. Stacey, I tell you, I mean, we don't have enough time. I could talk to you. I have to have you back. And I'd love to have you.
Okay.
I'd love to have you back. I mean, this is such an important conversation, and I really value what you're doing. Let me just, I want to share your book. Your most recent book is called "Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts," and that's
And
available. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it has a subtitle, What Family, Friends, and Partners Can Say and Do.
Okay. And this book is for whom?
Family, friends, and partners.
Okay.
I mean, the title is Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, but I say in the introduction, and that's because it's in a series that the publisher created, a Loving Someone with series. But you don't need to love the person for the book to be beneficial. It's just if there's someone you care about, someone you know, and you don't know what to say, because so many people, they're like, what do I do?
Right.
They don't know at all what to do. So primarily it's, for loved ones, but also just anybody who's not a mental health professional and wants to be able to help. And then some people have said to me, well, mental health professionals should read it too. Perhaps, but my other book was for professionals. But it's meant to be a guide for people who feel like, that they don't know what to do, and that there's a misconception that only therapists or psychiatrists or doctors can help. And really, the frontline people, the ones that suicidal people confide in the most, are friends and family.
And I mean, just to be clear, suicidal thoughts are one thing, but suicidal intent is something entirely different, right? But again, we could talk. I want to continue talking about this at a later date. I'd love to have you back. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Sure. Well, they can go to my website, staceyfreedenthal.com, and there's a contact form there. I think it's on the About page. But also I have a website called speakingofsuicide.com, and there's a contact form there. And also people often leave comments that are meant just as notes for me, and I don't publish those comments. There are comments I publish because people leave comments on articles. So those I think would be the best ways. And then also if they just want to email me, it's sfreedenthal@gmail.com.
Okay. Appreciate that. Fascinating having you here. And I'm so glad that I met you. I'd love to have you back at a later time.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll take you up on that.
Definitely. Take care.
Thanks.
I want to thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I want to let you know that I am very excited about my new podcast, The Right Now Project. The Right Now Project is about healing. It's about stepping into our own courage and authenticity and getting started or continuing along our healing process. We're all going through something, whatever it is, in this crazy life we're living. And the Right Now Project is about honoring that, celebrating that, and sharing our stories via the associated membership site. Check us out at therightnowproject.com, therightnowproject.com.